I truly have a problem with authority, and any chance I can get to belittle authority, I love to do it.
In 1974, Richard Nixon resigned as president, and the country was tired of politics. America was jaded, and this would only grow after Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, thus robbing many Americans of justice that they felt they deserved. John Carpenter was one of those jaded Americans. He saw the future of America as dark and bleak. From this came his idea for Escape from New York, and in that world there was no humor, no kindness, just hell, with leaders who cared little for the masses because they had power.
I think probably I made everybody corrupt in this world, every single person corrupt in this world, made it, and it's an entirely a nihilistic corruption blanket of this future.
Now, there is some confusion about when Carpenter wrote his first script, but the year 1974 is the most common thing mentioned in interviews with Carpenter and Deborah Hill. There are some interviews that state he wrote this film in film school, and others that say he wrote it after film school.
John Carpenter had written Escape from New York when he was at USC.
I wrote it right out of film school in 1974.
Whatever the case, John left film school around 1972, before Nixon left the White House, to focus on Dark Star. He tried to pitch his Escape from New York idea, but studios rejected it, saying it was too dark, and the film had no respect for the office of the presidency. By 1979, Carpenter made it big with Halloween, and we covered this movie in a previous video, so check it out. After Halloween, Carpenter wanted to change gears and make something dramatic. There were different offers for him to direct, but the first thing that got his attention was a television movie called Elvis for ABC. When Carpenter came on the project, the role for Elvis was already promised to Kurt Russell by executives. But they found a man who looked just like Elvis, and when Carpenter came to the job, they wanted him to choose which person to play the role, the look-alike or Russell. When he took the job, he worked in an office on Sunset Boulevard, and it was time for him to pick. The look-alike looked great, but couldn't act his way out of a paper bag. Carpenter frankly asked Russell if he thought he could play Elvis, and Russell's response was, "Oh, sure." So Carpenter let him go for it. At this point in his life, Russell was an actor since 1963 and was best known as a Disney star who was in kiddie films. He just couldn't break free of that image. But when he met Carpenter, John saw something that many had not seen in Kurt.
It's hard to describe what Kurt is like, okay? Kurt, when he does a performance in a movie or a television show or any kind of acting, never thinks about what he's going to do. He is an instinctual actor. He is a born mimic. He could do me, he could do you, he could do anybody. He soaks up people and he gives it back out.
During the filming of Elvis, John and Kurt really bonded. John stated that Russell was very easy to direct because Russell was classically trained and never hesitated. Kurt knew where the camera was. He knew what he needed to do and then did it, and this made everything easy when directing Elvis. Within no time, John and Kurt would tease each other in fun ways, and they rarely talked about what was needed in a shot. Instead, they would talk about trivial things, and when John called for action, Russell would just instinctually deliver. When it was over, Elvis did well. Kurt's co-star of the film was Susan Hubley, who played Priscilla Presley, and Kurt and Susan married after filming. John found himself hanging out with the couple, where they talked a lot, and Kurt confided to John that he just wanted to play a character that was not nice and had no care for others to the point of almost being a bad guy in order to break out of his Disney image. John continued to move forward with his next film, The Fog, while Russell was stuck doing another television movie called Amber Waves. After Russell finished Amber Waves, he tried for a rated R comedy called Used Cars to break his Disney image. Used Cars was not a failure, but it was not a huge success either. On the other hand, John Carpenter's The Fog was very successful, while Russell was deemed by many Hollywood execs as a TV star or at best a B-movie actor outside Disney. In essence, Kurt Russell was deemed to not be a big box office draw. Avco Embassy Pictures head Bob Reamy wanted to continue working with Carpenter after The Fog and asked him to make a thriller, The Philadelphia Experiment. Carpenter read the script and realized it had no ending, and as he rewrote it, he said he just couldn't do it. Reamy responded that they made a deal to make a movie together, and this is what John's response was.
And I said, well, I have this script in my trunk I've had since 1973 or 4 called Escape from New York. So I let him read that, and he said, sure, let's do it.
With the Greenlight, Carpenter looked at the script again and realized that it needed some updating because the script was a straight action film that was inspired by Death Wish and Dirty Harry. So he called his college buddy and fellow bandmate Nick Castle to collaborate on the project to make it a better screenplay. Nick brought a whole new life to the project as he introduced all of the humor. It was Nick who created the troupe singing the ridiculous song in the theater. He created the character of Cabby, and as a joke, honoring John Wayne's classic Big Jake, where everyone says, "I thought you were dead."
Just who in the hell do you think you are?
Jacob McCandles.
I thought you were dead, Mr. McCandles.
Not hardly.
I thought you were dead.
As well as the president being a fool after Snake switched the tape at the end of the film.
All the kind of humorous exchanges Nick and I worked on together, he brought that kind of spark to it.
Some other changes that John wanted to make in his original script was to have a role for his wife, Adrienne Barbeau, and he wanted her to be as tough as nails, because most of the dominant people in New York would be ruthless, and she had to have little restraint. This role was created for me. He wrote it with me in mind. I guess there is something that I connect with about being the strong woman, the heroine who could handle herself and maybe bail out a couple other people at the same time, but who isn't a cartoon character. To give her character believability, security, and purpose, they created the character of Brain to be her love interest, and at the same time, she doubled as his muscle. We wanted to put her in a relationship with a guy. If you were living in Manhattan, what do you need most of anything? You need oil and gas. You need power. You need electricity. So we wanted to create this character of Brain, played by Harry Dean Stanton, and put him together with Maggie as a couple. For Snake Plisken, Carpenter originally wrote the script thinking of Clint Eastwood, but with a $6 million budget, Carpenter's biggest to date, Eastwood would most likely take a huge chunk of that money, and Eastwood was a fellow director with a lot of power. Carpenter wanted to have total control over his film. He didn't want to worry about power players challenging him on his movie, and that is one of the reasons he didn't pick Charles Bronson either to play the part. Bronson had an active interest in playing the role, but Carpenter shied away. He also expressed that he wanted someone younger to play Snake Plisken. In the back of Carpenter's mind, Kurt Russell hovered. He knew this was a part Kurt was chomping at the bit to play, but Avco kept pushing names at John Carpenter like Chuck Norris and Tommy Lee Jones. Again, John felt Russell was the way to go, and his reasoning was simple.
And I had had such a great experience on Elvis because he made my life easy. He wasn't a demanding actor. He came ready to go, and he quit work and went home, and he didn't bring problems to the set. And at the time, Charles Bronson had expressed interest in playing that part. And I've always loved Charles Bronson, but I thought, that's going to be, he's going to direct. Now, I'm not going to be able to direct, but with Kurt, I can direct the movie, so I convinced them that Kurt could be an action star.
With Kurt, he knew there would be no clashes or egos on the film, and he would have 100% control. When John approached the studio about his idea to cast Kurt, Avco was stunned and stated, "He's a Disney actor." Carpenter did as the studio asked and considered Tommy Lee Jones, but eventually he passed, and Avco finally relented to Carpenter and let him cast Russell in the part. Lee Van Cleef's career in the 70s was less stellar than it was during the 60s, and by chance, his name was brought up to Carpenter.
Associate producer on the film, Peggy Brotman, had been a casting director, and she said, who hasn't been seen in a long time is Lee Van Cleef. And how cool was he back in the old days, and how cool was he in the spaghetti westerns? And so I met with him, and he was cool. I mean, he is Lee.
For Cabby, Carpenter sent Ernest Borgnine the script, and then took him to dinner at a smokehouse. He then asked him to play cabbie, and Borgnine's response was not that enthusiastic.
I said, yeah, I don't want to play a cabbie. I said, hell, I could do a cabbie like with my eyes closed. I said, the part that I had in mind was, something like Lee Van Cleef, No, he says, I've already given it to Lee Van Cleef. I want to play the warden.
John stated he wrote the character with him in mind, and eventually Borgnine accepted the role more because of flattery than desire. Another actor that took convincing was Donald Pleasence. John contacted him, and Pleasence flat out asked him, "Why me?" In response, John wrote him an impassioned letter.
So I made up this long story about the fact that the president somehow got involved with Margaret Thatcher, and Reagan becomes a lord, and the president is basically their son.
Pleasence embraced the idea of being the son of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, working for an America that was back under the control of the British Empire. He would forever repeat his character origin story whenever the president of the film was discussed. Some sources, which include the official story of the film, state the idea came from Pleasence, but as you can see from the 1994 interview I just showed you, such a statement can be debated. For Brain, Warren Oates was originally cast, but he soon became ill and had to bow out. Before he left, Oates suggested they talk to Harry Dean Stanton, which Carpenter did. John Carpenter wanted me, so he called me on the phone. I never met him. I said, "How are you, John? I've read the script, but I like to change the lines when I don't like them." He said, "You can do anything you want, as long as you don't mess with my plot." He's easy to be with, and he leaves the actors alone, and he knows what he's doing. On June 4th, 1980, Carpenter and Castle finished their shooting script, and we will cover this script in detail as we go over the movie itself. Before filming began, the production needed to address an evident problem, and that was they didn't have enough money to film in New York. They were allowed to film a few shots on Staten Island, but there was no way they could film in the city. It was just too expensive. So they needed another option. Luckily, the production would find its salvation with St. Louis, Missouri, which suffered a very large urban fire on its waterfront. There were still many burned out buildings, and it already looked apocalyptic. St. Louis was very happy they were there to help their economy, and worked well with the production. The crew obviously knew that St. Louis and New York looked different, but it was the best chance they got to depict a dystopian New York. They accepted the overly critical folks who would point out that the sets were not New York, but they did their best to use lighting and camera angles to at least try their best to pass it off as New York. To make the location look ransacked, every night they would bring 4 trucks with junk around 6 p.m. and spread it everywhere with forklifts. By 6 a.m. every morning, they would put it back on the trucks so those who commuted through the areas during the day could do so. Filming began on August 4th, 1980. In the early days of filming, Russell walked into an area where he shouldn't have, and he came close to 4 thugs. Russell stated they looked really rough, and he was in full costume.
I just looked at these guys, and they looked at me. And this is how different this was at that time. When you saw that guy with a serious machine gun and a knife and a bunch of stuff you didn't know what it was even, and that gun which had I just flashed that light a little bit on the gun, and these guys looked at me, and they were pretty rough characters, and they went, "Hey man, easy."
After this occurred, Russell was very excited and went to John Carpenter stating, "Hey man, I think this guy is going to work." The shoot was very fast and demanding, but in moments when the actors waited for shots, they would have to make do outside in 100-degree heat where they were picked apart by mosquitoes. Still, many had good things to say about the shoot. I have fond memories of sitting on a chain at Rock Bridge when we filmed at dusk and finished at dawn. I would sit down listening to Ernest Borgnine tell his stories of his experience in acting, and I was just like a kid when I was 5. It was great. The shoot went by quick and was extremely smooth because Carpenter was an independent filmmaker and didn't have studio interference. Plus, Carpenter was very collaborative and allowed any actor or crew member, no matter who they were, to bring their experience and ideas to the table. The shoot would end in November 1980. For special effects, money was tight. Veteran production designer Joe Alves from Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind had a tight budget. His set construction was only $500,000, while the effects budget was only $360,000. To help make it work, Carpenter hired Roger Corman alumni Robert and Dennis Skotak to make it work. Other Corman veterans would help, including one James Cameron, who would do some matte paintings of New York. For the soundtrack, John Carpenter worked with Alan Howarth. The way the scoring worked, John would have cigarettes and coffee while playing notes on his piano. Alan was at the synthesizer matching his directives.
And he was kind enough to share writer's credit with me. So, I felt very there was no holdback. If I had something to throw in, I'd toss it in there. And, so whatever he had and whatever I had became those works.
An LP soundtrack was released with the film, and so was a novel by Mike McQuay. The book was based off of Carpenter's script. If you want to read this novel, expect to pay over $60 to do so. But this novel does add a lot of details to the film, which were mostly in the original shooting script, and we will cover such things in our next video. Escape from New York arrived to theaters on July 10th, 1981, with a price tag around $6 million. The current box office champ was Raiders of the Lost Ark, which would net a whopping $212.2 million during its original release. To put into context how powerful this film's ticket sales were, it would remain in theaters for over 8 months, and in March 1982, it was in the 7th spot. It had legs, and the only thing that gave Raiders of the Lost Ark competition was Superman 2, which made $108.2 million. While these two films slugged it out, there were other strong films like Cannonball Run, Stripes, and of course, James Bond's serious return to form in For Your Eyes Only. The week before Escape from New York's arrival, Blake Edwards' S.O.B. was released and had a fair turnout, but Stripes took away most its business. When Escape from New York arrived, so did Disney's Fox and the Hound, which garnered a respectable $39.9 million. Escape had some steep challenges, but it would fare well, making $35.2 million. The week after, Endless Love, Zorro the Gay Blade, and the powerhouse Arthur came out. Escape held in there, and this was particularly because a bunch of small films were released on July 24th, like Tarzan the Ape Man, Blowout, Wolfen, Eye of the Needle, and Gas. They were not strong enough to take attention away from Escape from New York. Escape would last another week when Victory and Under the Rainbow would be released. During August, Escape would begin its downward trek. Despite this, the movie was a great profit for Avco and was very successful due to its small budget. During the release of Escape from New York, my family just moved to Briarwood Apartments on the south side of Toledo within walking distance of Southwick Mall. I rarely had money to see movies at that time, so I was relegated to seeing everything on television for the next several years. But during that summer, I was very curious to see what they would do with Superman 2, and managed to get my hands on some of the trading cards for that movie, as well as the new film Raiders of the Lost Ark that every kid around me was talking about. At this time, we were in a new place, and it was my 8th move in 3 years. To adapt, I paid attention to what other kids liked rather than what I liked, which was all movies and Star Wars figures. I specifically remember that at this time, the big thing was Dungeons and Dragons, which was having a huge growth spurt, and most kids were into Atari around then as well.
You got Space Invaders?
Nope.
You got Asteroids?
Nah, but my dad does. Can't even sit on the toilet some days.
Anyways, I first saw Escape from New York around 1986 while I was stuck in an uncomfortable boarding school called Grove School in Connecticut. I was stunned at how Carpenter made this world feel bleak, and it reminded me of The Perfect Good, the Bad, the Ugly. I could pretty much relate to many of the characters in the prison without hope. In most low-income apartment projects, all the kids know there are some places you stay away from. especially at night, and there was safety in numbers. And there were plenty of personalities, especially adults, and some acted loony for whatever substance or psychological reasons. My mother literally knew someone who looked and acted just like Brain, and there were a few bully kids who acted just like Romero and the Duke. It's like they went to my neighborhood in Norwich to create these characters, and the authorities to all of us seemed as unfeeling as Houck, whether it was rational or not. I related to the world, as terrible as it sounds, and Snake didn't talk much like myself back then, and so he was a perfect avatar for me as a boy, because Snake sadly shared my 14-year-old cynicism to the T back then. Today, I still love this movie, and now that I have laid out my bias plainly for all of you to know, we shall next go into the details of this movie itself. And in part 3, we're even going to touch on Escape from LA and some of the comics. And for those of you who love the Duke of New York, I suggest you remember,
You are the Duke of New York. You're a number one.
We will see you next time. If you like what you see here, click like and subscribe. Super thanks helps, but sharing helps a lot more.